When I walked into the sterile, quiet courtroom that morning, my daughter, Clara, rolled her eyes and leaned over to whisper something dismissive into her husband's ear. Richard smirked, his gaze sweeping over me with a look of bored contempt. They were sitting at the plaintiff's table, looking confident, impatient, as if this were just a minor inconvenience, a piece of paperwork to finalize before they could get on with their lives, my life. But then, an extraordinary thing happened. The judge, a formidable man with a graying beard and eyes that had seen too much, looked up from his papers as my name was called. He froze. I saw his knuckles go white on the gavel. He stared at me, not as a judge looks at a defendant, but as a man looks at a ghost. "My God," he murmured, his voice just loud enough to carry in the sudden, absolute silence of the room. "It's her. It's Adeline Hayes." The entire courtroom fell still. Clara and Richard's expressions of smug superiority dissolved into pure, baffled confusion. None of them, least of all my daughter, had any idea who I really was. That trial changed everything. My name is Adeline Hayes. I am 68 years old, and until a few months ago, I was just a regular, everyday grandmother. Each morning, I woke at 6, brewed my coffee in the same chipped porcelain mug I'd used for 20 years, and looked out the window of my small kitchen as I watered the African violets my late husband, Arthur, had loved so much. It was a simple, predictable life, full of small, quiet rituals that gave me peace. For 45 years, I was the mother who sacrificed everything. I worked nights, cleaning office buildings in downtown Boston. I sold homemade jams at the Brookline Farmers Market. I sewed clothes for wealthy women on Beacon Hill to make a few extra dollars. It was all so my only daughter, Clara, could have the life I never did. I poured my youth, my energy, and every spare cent into her education. I sold my own mother's wedding band to pay for her tuition at Boston College. When she married Richard, an arrogant, ambitious man who never said a kind word to me, I swallowed my pride. I welcomed them into my home every Sunday, the table set with my best linens and a bright, forced smile. I thought that after Arthur passed away, Clara and I would grow closer, bound by our shared grief. How naive I was. Instead of finding comfort in our shared company, my daughter began to see me as a burden. Her visits became brief, obligatory, and cold. Her calls grew less frequent. Her excuses for avoiding me became more and more creative. The greatest humiliation of my life, the moment the cracks finally showed, came on a gray Thursday in October. I had prepared chicken and dumplings, the kind that took me 4 hours to make, the rich, creamy stew that always made her smile when she was a little girl. I put out my best tablecloth, the one with the hand-embroidered lilacs, and even bought fresh flowers for the centerpiece. When they arrived, Richard walked into my house as if he owned it. He didn't say hello. He tossed his leather briefcase onto my polished dining table, leaving a scratch, slumped into Arthur's armchair, and turned on the television, the volume obnoxiously loud. Clara, wearing a sharp, expensive-looking green dress, wore an expression as cold as the January ice on the Charles River. "Mom, we need to talk," she said in that clipped corporate voice she had developed since she married him. A voice that sounded like a stranger's. She sat on the edge of the dining chair, as if in a hurry to leave. "Mark and I have made a decision," she continued. "This house is just too big for you. You can't maintain it alone anymore. And frankly, we need a bigger place, for when we have kids. We found the perfect retirement community for people your age." I felt the floor open up beneath my feet. This house. The house where Clara had taken her first steps. The house where we had celebrated every birthday. The house where Arthur had died, holding my hand. Every corner held our most sacred memories. Every photograph on the wall told our story. "But Clara, this is our home. All our memories are here," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "Memories are in the heart, Mom, not on the walls," she replied, a cold, rehearsed line that chilled me to the bone. "Besides, the community has activities for people like you. Bingo on Tuesdays. You'll be better off there. You'll have company your own age." Richard, his eyes glued to the television, smiled with satisfaction. He pulled a laser measure from his pocket and began measuring the dimensions of my living room, as if he were already placing his own furniture. "It's for the best, Mrs. Hayes," he added, not even looking at me. "We'll take care of all the paperwork. Don't you worry about a thing." My heart, which I thought had already broken when Arthur died, shattered into 1,000 new pieces. My own daughter, the child for whom I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and my dreams, was throwing me out of my own house to give it to this despicable man. Tears threatened to fall, but I swallowed them back. I would not give them the pleasure of seeing me cry. "I need time to think," I murmured, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "There's not much to think about, Mom," Clara replied, standing up. "It's already decided. They're coming to appraise the house next week." And with that, they left. They left my chicken and dumplings untouched, the steam rising from the uneaten bowls. They left my flowers wilting and my heart in pieces on the table where we had once been a happy family. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark kitchen, staring at the photographs on the wall. Clara as a baby. Clara on her first day of school, her backpack almost as big as she was. Clara at her graduation, me standing beside her, my face split in a grin of pure, unadulterated pride. How had it come to this? How had the girl who once told me I was her hero now treat me like I was garbage? The following days were a living nightmare. Richard brought a real estate appraiser, a man in a gray suit who walked through my home as if it were a foreclosure. He took notes, measured rooms, and talked about potential and necessary renovations, as if I wasn't even there. "The pipes are old," the appraiser said, tapping a wall, "and these kitchen tiles are hopelessly dated. You'd have to change everything." My Arthur had laid those blue and white tiles with his own hands when Clara was 10 years old. Each one represented an afternoon of work, of love, of hope for our future. To them, they were just obstacles. The humiliation reached its lowest point when Clara brought home glossy brochures for the retirement community. "Look, Mom, it has beautiful gardens, and they have bingo on Tuesdays," she said in that fake, bright voice she used when she wanted to convince me of something. "Plus, there's a nurse on duty 24/7. You'll be safer." Safer. I had lived in this house for 30 years. I knew all my neighbors. I had my routines, my violets, my memories. But to Clara, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that I get out of her way. The day I least expected it, they arrived with more papers. Richard walked in, followed by Clara and a man in a suit who introduced himself as their lawyer. "Mrs. Hayes," the lawyer began, "we have all the documents prepared for the transfer of the property. We just need your signature." "Transfer?" I asked, my voice thin. "I thought you were going to sell the house." Clara avoided my gaze. "Well, Mark and I decided to keep it. It's better for the family to hold on to properties. It's an asset." That's when I understood everything. It wasn't just that they wanted me out. They wanted to take my house, the only significant legacy my husband and I had built. It was a robbery, disguised as filial concern. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice shaking but finding a new cold edge. Richard stood up abruptly, his face changing, the mask of the concerned son-in-law dropping to reveal the predator beneath. "Ma'am," he said, "you're no longer in a condition to make these decisions. Clara is your only heir, and she is acting in your best interest." "This is my house," I yelled, surprising myself with my own strength, "and I am not leaving." "Mom, don't make this harder," Clara murmured, finally showing some discomfort. "You know you can't keep living alone. Last week, you forgot to turn off the gas stove." It was a lie, a breathtaking, vicious lie. I had never forgotten to turn off the stove in my life. But Richard smiled, as if he had just found the perfect excuse. "Come on, Clara. Your mother isn't well. It's dangerous to leave her alone." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you don't sign voluntarily, we might have to explore other legal options. A mental incapacity proceeding, for instance." The world closed in on me. My own daughter was willing to have me declared incompetent to steal my house. The man I had accepted as a son-in-law was threatening me in my own living room. And I, a 69-year-old woman, was completely alone. "I need time," I muttered, defeated. "You have 1 week," Richard said coldly. "Then we'll do what we have to do." When they left, I collapsed into Arthur's armchair and cried as I hadn't since his funeral. I cried for the daughter I had lost, for the home they were taking, for the life that was crumbling. I felt betrayed, humiliated, defenseless. That night, for the first time in my life, I considered giving up. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old, too weak, too useless to fight. But then, something deep inside me, a small, hard kernel of dignity that had survived 45 years of sacrifice, refused to die. I wasn't going to let them trample me without a fight. The next day, Clara came back alone. For a moment, my heart filled with hope. Had she reconsidered? Had she come to apologize? "Mom, I came to help you pack," she said in that robotic voice, carrying a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. "We can start with your clothes." I stared at her, searching for any trace of the girl I had raised. I found only a stranger. For the next few hours, Clara began to pack my belongings as if they were worthless objects. She took my family photos from the mantel and shoved them carelessly into a box. She packed the volumes of poetry Arthur had given me, the dishes from my wedding china, the tablecloths I had embroidered. "This dress is so old, Mom," she said, holding up my black wool mourning dress, the one I had worn to Arthur's funeral. "I don't think you'll need this." "Leave it," I begged. "Please, just leave it." She sighed, annoyed, but put it in a donation bag. My pain didn't matter. My feelings didn't matter. I didn't matter. The final straw was when she found my small, velvet-covered jewelry box. Inside was my wedding ring, the pearl earrings Arthur had given me for our 20th anniversary, and a small, delicate gold locket that had belonged to my mother. "This jewelry will be safer in a bank-safe deposit box," Clara said, her voice devoid of emotion. And before I could react, she slipped the entire box into her designer handbag. "Those are mine," I yelled, trying to snatch the purse from her. "Mom, you're getting very upset," she replied, stepping back, her hand raised as if to ward off a lunatic. "This just confirms you can't take care of yourself. You're becoming hysterical." In that moment, I knew I had lost my daughter forever. The Clara I knew had died, and in her place was this heartless woman, a puppet manipulated by her husband and blinded by greed. That night, when Clara left, taking my jewelry and my most precious memories with her, I was left alone in my half-empty house. The bare walls, marked with the ghosts of picture frames, reminded me of how little I had left. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by open boxes and scattered memories, and wondered how it had come to this. At what point had I become invisible? The following days were a living hell. Richard came by early every morning to supervise, as if I were a child. He brought in more strangers, contractors, designers who measured, photographed, and appraised every corner. They talked about me as if I weren't present. "The lady will have to speed up the process," Richard said to Clara on the phone. "The movers are coming on Monday." It was Friday. I had 3 days left in the home where I had lived for 30 years. "What if I'm not finished packing?" I asked in a whisper. "Don't worry, Mom," Clara's voice came over the speakerphone, tinny and distant. "The movers will take care of everything. Just take what's essential." Essential. As if an entire lifetime could be reduced to what was essential. That afternoon, after they left, I walked through my house like a ghost. I touched the walls Arthur had painted. I sat in his old leather armchair. I opened his desk drawer, a place I rarely disturbed, full of old letters, paid bills, and some documents I had never looked at. Most were unimportant, but in the very back, under a stack of old blueprints, I found a heavy, leather-bound folder I had never seen. It was marked with Arthur's initials and had a small, old-fashioned brass lock. Curious and desperate to connect with a time when my life made sense, I looked for the key. I found it, taped inside his favorite copy of Leaves of Grass, marking a page about the future. When I opened the folder, my world changed forever. My hands trembled as I read the will, a will I had never seen. My quiet, modest Arthur hadn't just been a professor. For decades, he had been quietly, brilliantly investing every extra dime. He had bought small properties in the 1,980 seconds. He had invested in fledgling tech stocks in the 90 seconds. He had accumulated a wealth I never could have imagined. But that wasn't all. The will clearly specified that I, Adeline Hayes, was the sole heir to everything. Clara would only receive a small trust fund, and only upon my death, with a specific, chilling clause, provided she has taken care of her mother with the love and respect she deserves. Arthur had been wiser than I thought. He had seen something in Richard that I had refused to recognize. There were more surprises. My husband was the owner of the entire apartment building where Clara and Richard lived. The apartment they thought they were paying rent on was, in fact, mine. All the tenants in that building were paying rent into an account I knew nothing about. With trembling fingers, I found the bank statements. The amount was astronomical. For 9 years, I had been living as a poor widow, while a fortune was accumulating. And then, the final, stunning revelation. Arthur owned shares in the company where Richard worked, not just a few shares, a significant, controlling stake. I read and reread every document. Everything was there, perfectly organized, notarized, and legal. My husband had built a silent empire, and I was its empress, without even knowing it. At the very bottom, I found a personal letter, in Arthur's own hand. "My dearest Adeline," it began, "if you are reading this, I am no longer with you. Forgive me for not telling you while I was alive, but I wanted you to live a life free of the burden of this. You always sacrificed so much. I wanted to make sure you would never want for anything." Tears streamed down my cheeks. "I must also confess," he continued, "I never completely trusted Richard. There is an ambition in his eyes that worries me. That's why I structured everything this way. If Clara respects you, she will have a comfortable life. But if she ever treats you badly, or tries to take advantage of you, you now have the power to protect yourself. Use this power wisely, my love, not to hurt, but to protect and to teach. Deep down, Clara is a good person. She's just easily led, your husband who loves you for all eternity." He had seen it. He had foreseen exactly what was happening. He had left me a shield, a sword, and a suit of armor. I sat on the floor, surrounded by documents worth millions, crying for the wise, loving man I had lost. But for the first time in months, they were not tears of defeat. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, and of a cold, quiet, righteous anger. Clara and Richard thought they were stripping me of my last possession. They had no idea that my little house in Brookline was the least valuable thing I owned. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind was working, planning. My husband had given me power. Now, I had to decide how to use it. Monday morning arrived with a light rain. Clara and Richard showed up at 9, the large moving truck rumbling behind them. They expected to find me defeated, packed, and ready for the community. Instead, they found me sitting calmly in Arthur's armchair, sipping tea, my house exactly as it had been. "Mom, what are you doing?" Clara asked, her voice sharp with impatience. "The movers are here. They're on the clock." "I'm not leaving," I replied, taking a sip of tea. Richard stepped forward, his face darkening with that familiar aggression. "Mrs. Hayes, we already talked about this. You don't have a choice." "On the contrary, Richard," I said, "I think it's you who doesn't understand the situation." I gestured to the coffee table, where I had placed a single document. "Did you know that your apartment, the one you've been living in for 3 years, has never been paid to the real owner?" Clara frowned. "What are you talking about? We pay our rent every month." "Yes, you do," I said, "to a property management company that, in turn, deposits the money into a trust. My trust. I own the building." The silence was sudden and absolute. Richard snatched the document, the deed to their building, from the table. His face went pale as he read. This is impossible. This has to be fake. It's as real as the fact that you were throwing me out of my own house to take it for yourselves," I said, not knowing that this house is the least valuable thing I own. Clara collapsed onto the sofa, her legs giving out. "Mom, why? Why didn't you ever tell us?" "Because I didn't know myself until 3 days ago. Arthur was much smarter than any of us imagined. What a visionary he was." Richard was pacing the room, agitated. "This changes everything. Clara, if she owns the building, she can evict you." I finished for him. "And I will. You have 30 days. "You can't do that," Clara cried, her voice cracking. "We're family." "Family?" The word tasted like bitterness, like when you were going to have me declared mentally incompetent, like when you packed my memories away like trash, like when you stole my mother's jewelry. Clara burst into tears, but this time they were not the manipulative tears I had come to expect. They were tears of genuine, abject terror. "Mom, please, we can fix this. It was all Richard's idea, all of it." "Clara!" he yelled, furious at her betrayal. "It's true," she sobbed. "He convinced me it was what was best for you. He said you were losing your memory. He said you were a danger to yourself." "And you believed him?" I asked, my heart breaking all over again. "You know your mother so little that you believed him over your own intuition?" The movers, who had been waiting awkwardly at the door, finally stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am, are we taking the stuff or not?" "No," I replied firmly. "Nothing is being moved. You can go." Richard, seeing his entire plan disintegrate, tried one last manipulation. "Adeline, we can come to an agreement. Clara's pregnant." "Are you really going to throw your own grandchild out on the street?" I felt the punch in my stomach. Pregnant. My grandchild. They had hidden that too, waiting to use it as a weapon. I looked at Clara, who was sobbing into her hands, and I remembered Arthur's words, not to hurt, but to teach. "Congratulations on the baby, Clara," I said. "But that doesn't change what you did. It doesn't erase the last 2 months." "This is emotional blackmail," Richard snarled. "You're using your money to manipulate us." "Manipulation?" I laughed. "Like when you used my supposed mental incompetence to manipulate me? It's different, isn't it, Richard? It's different when I'm the one holding the cards." "Mom, please," Clara begged. "What can we do to make you change your mind?" "You want an agreement?" I said, standing up. "Fine. Here is the agreement. I want a public, sincere apology. I want you, Clara, to admit that you betrayed me. And I want Richard to admit that this was all his idea, that he is a manipulative, greedy coward." Richard's face turned purple. "I will never humiliate myself in front of you." "Then get ready to move," I said simply. "Mark, please," Clara pleaded with him. "She's my mother. It's our baby." "No," he yelled. "I am not going to bow down to this manipulative old woman." The insult hung in the air. Clara's sobs stopped. She looked at her husband, finally, truly seeing him for the man he was. "Manipulative old woman?" she whispered. "Yes," he raged, all pretense gone. "A bitter old lady who can't stand to see her daughter happy. That's why she made up this whole story. This money is probably fake." "Fake?" I walked to the desk and picked up another file. "Are these bank statements fake? Are these stock certificates fake? Are these—" I said, pulling out the last, most damning document. "The majority share certificates for the company you work for?" Richard froze. His face went from purple to a sickly, waxy white. You wouldn't," he stammered. "Oh, I would," I said. "In fact, I've already scheduled a board meeting for tomorrow morning to discuss your gross misconduct and your attempt to defraud a majority shareholder. Now, Richard, do you still think I'm a bitter, manipulative old woman? Or am I just the woman who owns your entire life?" He didn't speak. He just stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Get out," I said. He looked at Clara, expecting her to follow. "Amelia, let's go." Clara stood up slowly, her face streaked with tears. She looked at Richard, at his hateful, defeated expression. Then she looked at me, at the mother she had betrayed. "No," she whispered. "What did you say?" he snarled. "I said no," she repeated, her voice stronger. "I am sick of your manipulations. I am sick of you using me to hurt my mother. I'm sick of you. Get out. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. he threatened. "You're having my child." "I am having my child," she retorted, "and I will not raise him to be like you." He looked at her, at me, at the documents on the table. He knew he had lost. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the walls trembled. Clara and I were left alone, the silence heavy, the air thick with the wreckage of our family. "Mom," she whispered, her voice broken, Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at her, this daughter who had grown up and gotten lost. This woman who was carrying my grandchild. "I don't know, Clara," I said honestly. "You hurt me more than you can possibly imagine." "I know," she sobbed. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." "Starting with what?" I asked. "Starting with giving you this," she said, pulling my mother's velvet jewelry box from her purse, "and by asking if I can stay here. Just for tonight. I have nowhere else to go." I looked at the jewelry box. Then I looked at my pregnant, broken daughter. "One night," I said, "you can stay in your old room. But tomorrow, we start talking about how you're going to earn back my trust." She nodded. Tears of gratitude now. "Thank you, Mom. I'll make it right. I promise." I knew promises were just words. The real work was just beginning. The next few days were tense. Clara lived in her old room, walking through the house like a polite stranger. But I was watching, and I saw her try. She washed her dishes. She helped in the garden. She asked about my day, and she actually listened to the answer. On the third day, she found me watering my violets. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking. It wasn't just him. I let him. It was easier to blame you than to admit I'd married the wrong man. He isolated me. He told me you were old-fashioned, that you wouldn't understand. He made me feel guilty for loving you." It was the first truly honest thing she'd said. My daughter had been a victim of coercive control, and I had been too hurt to see it. 2 months later, the trial began. Richard, true to his word, had sued for custody of the unborn child and financial manipulation, claiming I had blackmailed him. That was the morning we walked into the courtroom. That was the morning Judge Samuel Harding looked up and saw me. "Mrs. Hayes?" he'd asked. "Adeline Hayes? From the Brookline Public Library?" I stared at him, and under the gray hair and the black robe, I saw him, a shy, skinny teenager from 30 years ago. "David?" I murmured. "David Morales?" "Your Honor," Richard's lawyer interjected, "do you know this woman?" Judge Morales looked at me, his eyes shining. "This woman," he said to the courtroom, "was the head librarian at my local branch. I was a kid heading for trouble, with no future. She saw me reading in a corner, and she didn't kick me out. She brought me coffee. She gave me a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She told me I was smarter than the trouble I was in." He looked at me. "You saved my life, Mrs. Hayes." Richard and his lawyer were frozen. They knew, in that instant, they had lost. The judge recused himself, of course. But the damage was done. The new judge, having been briefed by Judge Morales on my character, and having seen the mountain of evidence, the will, the letter, the texts, the fraud, delivered a resounding verdict. Richard lost all his rights. He was ordered to pay emotional damages. He lost his job, as I had warned, and he left the state in disgrace. 6 months later, my granddaughter Lily was born. As I held her, I knew it had all been worth it. Clara, my Clara, had returned. She was now the loving mother I always knew she could be. One afternoon, as we rocked the baby in the garden, Clara asked, "Mom, have you really forgiven me?" I looked at her, at my daughter, who had fought her way back. "I forgive you, Clara, but more importantly, you've learned to forgive yourself." That night, I thought of Arthur's letter. I had used his power as he'd wished, not to hurt, but to protect and to teach. I had learned that true love isn't about blind sacrifice. It's about respect. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is to stand up for your own dignity. I had to lose my daughter to save her. 5 years passed. My life was full. Little Lily, now 4, ran through the garden, chasing butterflies. Clara, now a certified public accountant, had become a fierce advocate for women in abusive relationships. And me? I had used Arthur's fortune to establish the Home and Dignity Foundation, a refuge for elderly people facing familial abuse. What began as my pain had become my purpose. One afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Judge Morales, now retired, with an elegant woman. "Adeline," he said, "I want to introduce you to my wife. We're here to invite you to an event. The State Bar Association is giving you an award for your work with the foundation." "That's not necessary," I stammered. "Yes, it is," he insisted. "Your story inspired us all to reflect on true justice." That night, as I told Lily her favorite bedtime story, an adapted version about a brave grandmother who discovers she has magic powers to protect her family from a dragon, I thought about how strange destiny was. I had needed to lose everything to discover what I truly had. Clara sat with me on the porch, watching the fireflies. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" "About your father," I said, "and how proud he would be of you." "I learned from the best," she said, taking my hand. I had learned the most important lesson of all, that kindness is never, ever wasted. It is an investment. It is a seed you plant, and you may never know when or where it will bloom, only that it will. My small kindness to a troubled boy 30 years ago had returned to me, a full and beautiful harvest, at the exact moment I needed it most.